To All Shall See These presents greetings. Ruckdog here, back with another video for the Man Battle Station's YouTube channel. This one is a follow-up to the video I made, about 5 months or so ago, where I talked about the sudden rise of new Battlefleet Gothic rumors. These were inspired by an Instagram post on the official Games Workshop Instagram, where they showed a picture of the old Battlefleet Gothic box art. Now, as I said in that previous video, this was all rampant speculation, and so it comes as no surprise to find out that I was in fact wrong about a BFG relaunch, but we'll get to that in a minute. So, what are we going to talk about on this video? First of all, we'll talk about how I was wrong, we'll get to that. Then we're going to talk about some other developments in the world of Games Workshop specialist games. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what I call the Battlefleet Gothic cottage industry. This is sort of the ecosystem that's sprung up around the enduring popularity of the Battlefleet Gothic rule set. And this includes everything from designers of STLs to folks that are selling dice to folks that are selling whole entire models from a store that were manufactured using what you might refer to as traditional means, i.e. casting in resin or even metal. And then, once we get through all of that discussion, I do have a little bit of a discussion about where I might like to go next on the channel here in terms of video topics. And I would definitely like to get your feedback. And so, if you could stick around till the end to have that discussion, I would appreciate it. All right, so moving on to the elephant in the room. I was wrong, so wrong, about the impending nature of a Battlefleet Gothic relaunch. So at the time of the last video, I was predicting that maybe in a couple months, the major shows, Adepticon and Warhammer Fest, would provide an opportunity for Games Workshop to announce a relaunch of Battlefleet Gothic. Well, Adepticon and Warhammer Fest have come and gone, and there was no news. In fact, there was something of some anti-news. When directly asked about the reboot, the Games Workshop reps at these events were, shall we say, non-committal. So let this forever be a marker of how effective, quote-unquote, my prognostication skills are, in the event that you ever find yourself so inclined to believe another prediction that I might make in the future. All joking aside, though, I'm still disappointed a little that this didn't pan out, but not too disappointed. For some of the reasons that others pointed out in the comments of my first video, Battlefleet Gothic is in a pretty good place right now, whether you are playing the latest FAQ for the base rules or the expanded revised version. They've been pretty well smoothed out at this point by lots of community involvement and playtesting input. It's not the worst thing in the world that we don't have a new set of official rules coming to wipe the slate clean, so for now, I'm content to continue playing the game as is. I'm still very much a fan of Battlefleet Gothic as a game, and that's sort of what counts. Now, that being said, there has been some recent news of note. One thing that did come out of the recent announcements was a reboot of Epic that is in the works for release later this year. Called Legions Imperialis, it's essentially what has been rumored for years. A 30k themed, small-scale, mass battle game that is, at the very least, the spiritual successor for the old Epic series of games, although we don't quite know yet about the rules for this game as to whether or not it has any kind of ancestral DNA with the previous editions of Epic. Now, this is obviously not directly related to Battlefleet Gothic, and I get it. You know, it's a different game entirely. However, what makes this of interest, I believe, is that in its later years, Epic was part of the Games Workshop Specialist Games lineup, as was Battlefleet Gothic. And so one might naturally be led to consider the possibility that if we are getting a redo of one specialist game, the Games Workshop might very well do some others, like Battlefleet Gothic. So the reboot of Epic as Legions Imperialis is interesting for that reason. We'll be watching this closely to see how the new edition interacts with the existing community for Epic. The old version of Epic was Games Workshop's small-scale version of Warhammer 40k, roughly 6mm in scale versus 28mm for normal 40k. It got started decades ago as Space Marine, which then transmogrified into Epic 40k, and eventually Epic Armageddon, and that was the final GW iteration of the rule set. The community then continued to develop the rules, and now we have something called Net Epic, and that's still played to this day. This Heresy-era reboot is sort of returning to its roots under the old Space Marine title, I suppose. So, what's next? Well, going back to what I said a few minutes ago about being careful for what you ask for and being careful when it comes to my predictions, I think we're probably done for a while when it comes to any big new releases or announcements of new game releases from GW, and this includes Battlefleet Gothic. The biggest new thing right now, of course, is the Warhammer 40k 10th edition. And we are smack dab in the middle of the hype cycle for that, and that was before the announcements of Legions was made. So I imagine that most of the rest of 2023 is probably going to be dominated by all the different 10th edition announcements and goings-on, with the Legions game taking up much of the remaining space that's left after that. In such an environment, I imagine that Games Workshop is probably anxious to not further dilute the attention of its player base with a notional Battlefleet Gothic relaunch. And yes, as much as I think Battlefleet Gothic is an important game and a big part of the Warhammer 40k universe, it's still undoubtedly a sideshow as far as Games Workshop is concerned. Likewise, I would prefer that a Battlefleet Gothic relaunch happen outside of the major launch window for other Games Workshop games, especially a new edition of 40k, as I fear that the hype would result in sucking all the oxygen out of the room. Now, the question is, will Legions Imperialis hasten or delay a Battlefleet Gothic reboot? I think logic suggests that it will probably cause some delay given all the other games that Games Workshop is supporting. Over on the forums, MBS community member and sometime podcast guest Kelly proposed that this would be a delay for a Battlefleet Gothic redo of at least 3 years, pushing it out to 2026. Now that feels a bit pessimistic to me, but with Games Workshop, anything is possible. So there's still a chance that at some point in the not-too-distant future we may see a BFG reboot, but wise money is not happening anytime soon. And realistically speaking, next year is probably the earliest that we might see some news about a new edition of BFG. Possibly at Adepticon or Warhammer Fest again. So I have to keep coming back to the point, though. My track record on these predictions isn't all that great, so you should probably take them with a grain of salt. Alright, so now we turn our attention to what I mentioned at the start of the video, which is the Battlefleet Gothic ecosystem, or the cottage industry as I termed it. Now this is something I didn't really touch on during my last video, but since the end of official support from Games Workshop, and the rise of 3D printing especially, there's been a whole new generation of ship designs for Battlefleet Gothic. There are some places you can go where you can get already printed ships, and then there's lots of other places you can go to get the STL files. That's the digital file that you can feed to a printer to get your own ship model out the other end of it. This has really sort of caught fire in the last few years, and now there's a number of major players in the space that are producing some high-quality designs. For those of you that don't have any familiarity with 3D printing, this might be a little bit of some esoteric insider baseball, but one of the key members of this ecosystem are platforms such as Patreon and My Mini Factory. These platforms are key enablers. They allow you to subscribe to creators, pay them on a recurring basis, and get files from them in return. A great example of this, and one of the most prominent creators in the Battlefleet Gothic custom ship scene, is one I'm highlighting here, Soulforge Studios. Now, while their designs are very high quality, you of course have to pay for that quality. So this isn't the only option, though. You can still find a lot of free Battlefleet Gothic STLs floating around out there. These files are oftentimes available from places such as Thingiverse. Sometimes they are not as detailed, but they still provide a passable model that you can get printed relatively easily at home, or at public libraries, or through a third-party printing service. Then you are off to the races. Overall, I think 3D prints are probably the easiest and most cost-effective way to get a set of ships to play Battlefleet Gothic these days. But there are another option that's floating around out there that I would like to discuss, and that is the folks out there like Vanguard Miniatures that are selling full lines of Battlefleet Gothic compatible miniatures that have been manufactured using more traditional resin and metal casting methods. These designs are beautiful, and they really fit the 40k aesthetic as well, while at the same time having their own unique look for them. So whether you go the 3D printed route or you go the already produced route, such as through Vanguard, I still think this is probably the better way to go than trying to find old official Games Workshop models on eBay. The problem you have with going that route is you're basically going to be paying collector prices, which tends to value the ships more than they're worth, in my opinion, in the sense of just using them as tabletop gaming pieces. So, unfortunately, with the fact that Games Workshop's Battlefleet Gothic models are long out of production, that has tended to lead towards a steady rise in the prices for the official third-party models. And if I'm being completely honest, I think a lot of the newer production pieces from places like Vanguard or Soulforge Studios are actually a bit superior in terms of detail and overall appearance to some of the older Games Workshop sculpts that are now, 25 years old. So a little bit worse for the wear at this point, showing their age, shall we say. All right, so the last thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is what the impact of a reboot would have on this ecosystem. So obviously the possibility of a scale change and or an aesthetic change to the game would potentially render some of these third-party models obsolete. Likewise, if you can now go into your local store and buy some Battlefleet Gothic models off the shelf, that might make you somewhat less inclined to buy those models over the internet from a third party. And then finally, you might have a situation where there's just a greater preference for the newer designs, and that would then tend to result in some of these great online providers becoming less popular. So all that's a shame. I think that there's been a lot of work and effort put into some of these various third-party designs. Just as a full disclosure, I'm a member of the Soulforge Studios Patreon, so I'm definitely on that particular hype train. But there's still something to be said for the fact that there is a good chance that these third-party sellers will be able to continue even if a reboot happens. One of the things that's going to help in this regard, I think, is the fact that when it comes to Battlefleet Gothic, and really for that matter, most space combat games, the actual size and shape of the miniature really isn't all that important. And Battlefleet Gothic especially, the key consideration is the flying base. The distances in the game, or the ranges, are all measured from either the stem or the edge of the flying base. And so that means that the actual size, orientation, and shape of the model is much less important than it would be for games such as 40K that have true line of sight. And then, as I mentioned before, what happens with the relaunch of Epic via the Legion Imperialis is going to be very telling, I believe. So, the Epic game and the Battlefleet Gothic game are two very different games, and there is a bit of overlap in the player base, sure, but at the same time, they're still not quite the same fan base. But both being specialist games, both being sort of smaller niches of the 40K hobby, means, in my opinion, that they have quite a few similarities as well. You could almost call them cousins in that sense. And so, seeing how the wider Epic community reacts to the launch and the influx of new players via the new Legions game is going to be a potential bellwether for how a future relaunch of Battlefleet Gothic might go. We'll just have to wait and see on that one. All right, so having gotten through all of that, I now want to turn my attention to talk a little bit about the channel and what I've got going on and what's sort of floating around in my head for additional topics and for new videos down the road. This is not a Battlefleet Gothic channel, right? It's sort of I've always envisioned manned battle stations as a generalist naval gaming channel. But I do have a lot of respect for Battlefleet Gothic, maybe is the right word for it, and I also really enjoy the game. And so I've got a number of other Battlefleet Gothic related video ideas that I'd like to do. So in no particular order, I'd love to talk about the various hard copy paper publications that came out in support of the game. I'd like to talk a little bit about how the Battlefleet Gothic rule set evolved over time with things like how Ordnance changed and Nova Canon rules and so on. A new player guide video, sort of a video that you can point someone to and say, hey, if you're interested in Battlefleet Gothic, watch this video. This will give you an idea of where to start, that kind of thing. Then I'm talking a little bit about sort of an overview of Battlefleet Gothic websites, past and present. This is sort of a little bit of a trip down memory lane kind of idea, but also could be valuable in the sense that it might give folks an idea of where to go to find active Battlefleet Gothic focused communities around the web. And then finally, there's some things that I would love to sort of suss out of the Battlefleet Gothic rule set that I think provide some really interesting case studies as solutions to various game design problems. So there's all that, but then I also have a number of ideas that are not related to Battlefleet Gothic, and these are the ones that are sort of figuring most prominently in my head. First of all is something I'm tentatively calling the One Good Turn series. This is where I set up and play for the camera one turn of a naval game. The idea being that it gives a viewer a feeling for the game in about 10 or 15 minutes without having to watch a hour or multi-hour video series, sort of like the Captain's Academy I did for Dystopian Wars, about how to get into the really nitty-gritty details of the game. I have a video idea to talk about what makes a naval game. In other words, what characteristics, what features, what kind of tropes or conventions make a naval game. I'd like to talk a little bit about the adventures I've had in 3D printing and how that's influenced my naval gaming hobby. And I also want to talk a little bit about how playing naval games digitally can work. And this is something that's been featured on the channel a little bit already with things like Tabletop Simulator. I've got some ideas to do some more game roundups, including for Class A games. And then I also want to do a more general how to get into naval gaming and how to do it maybe on a little bit of a limited budget. So those are an incomplete list of ideas, but like I said, these are the ones that have been sort of most prominent in my thinking. Obviously, it's taking me longer to get these videos out than I would have liked. It's the summertime, kids are out of school, been busy doing all kinds of fun stuff and enjoying the great outdoors, and so that's sort of limited the amount of time I've had to do videos for the channel. But at the same time, I do intend to keep making videos for the channel, and I would very much appreciate any feedback all of you out there might have on which topics you'd like to see me tackle. If you have something that you are interested in me looking into that I don't have on the list, then by all means feel free to suggest it in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you on that. And we'll take it from there. I will say that probably the one I'm leaning to most right now is digging into the Battlefleet Gothic printed materials one. Just sort of continuing on my Battlefleet Gothic tear here a little bit. But we'll see. We'll see. Something else might come along that'll strike my fancy. Thank you so much for watching. This sort of brings us to the end of the video. If you like this video, I appreciate you giving me a thumbs up and a subscribe if you really like the video. And I really appreciate you guys for watching to this end here. And until next time, this is Ruck Dog saying good luck and good hunting.